Welcome to Girls Must Feed Pigs, Things Our Ancestors Thought and Said. I'm Darris Williams, and I'll be sharing a few examples from contemporary accounts that I found that illustrate the ways that our ancestors lived and a little bit about their interactions with neighbors, coworkers, and employers. To start, I want to share some information from the Poor Law Commissioner's survey that was done in the early 1840s. This is a really nice situation because it gives us the opportunity to use the 1841 census to look a little more and get some extra information to coordinate with what we find here. The Poor Law Commissioners went throughout the country of England, various places, and gathered information about the working conditions for women and children in agriculture. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is that we get detailed accounts, but if we look both superficially and a little more in depth, we can find some amazing information. The fact that a large-scale farmer like Edward Trude had several servants, both men, females, and males, boys and girls working for him, isn't surprising. But what is surprising is to learn, or the ability to learn, details about his interactions with his farm servants and apprentices. He gives details about his move away from utilizing apprentices on his farm, and even details situation where he took a whip to one of his apprentices. By the time of the 1841 census, he doesn't have apprentices working on his farm. The other thing that's interesting about the situation and this example specifically is that if we look a little deeper than just the idea that the farm servants, the girls that were farm servants, were feeding pigs and doing things like that, that maybe their family or friends from the home area didn't find too enjoyable or pleasing and looked down on it. What really struck me in this case was the fact that families could visit the farm servants on a Sunday, and that they did. That was very striking to me, and an insight that I don't think I could have picked up in any other sources, especially the normal historical sources that genealogists tend to focus on. The next example is from Jacob Nagle. He wrote a diary and recorded his experiences during the Napoleonic Wars. And he was a sailor for the East India Company, and upon returning home, he and several others traveled to London, and he gets into details about evading the army press gangs, and then once in London, free of the army inductions, he still had to deal with the Navy press gangs. And shortly after marrying, he was accosted by a Navy press gang and taken into service. He goes into quite a bit of detail about the ins and outs of it and his efforts to avoid it. But what's really interesting is that if we look at his marriage record in 1795 in London, we don't even get his occupation. But by finding a contemporary account, in this case by him, we get details about his life, a little bit about his wife, and her brothers and father. So this expands our experience, our knowledge, and understanding of the way our ancestors lived. And it really helps to put flesh on the bones of the bare facts that we get from census records and most church records. Now, this example comes from a church record that is, record that is used a little bit more often by family historians. It's a settlement examination. It was done in 1772 and gives us details of an individual who was born in Ireland. Although his father was American, he ended up going back to America, and was apprenticed on a ship in Philadelphia, where later he was met the press gang in Halifax and ended up in the British Navy. And he details information about his who he married, when and where, and how he was injured and lost his sight in both eyes, and eventually ended up as a beggar. Now, at the time, begging was illegal, and the parish officials took him in and were trying to determine where he needed to be to gather his, or to get welfare assistance. And that was the process that led to all of this information being recorded about him and his experiences. And I don't know where else you could get such a detailed, potted history of an individual at this time period. So the settlement examinations are a great resource. Another example is from another individual that kept a diary. William Thomas was a schoolmaster in South Wales. He recorded details about individuals for quite a few years, and it wasn't just in his own parish. In this case, we can see from the burial record from the bishop's transcripts that John Hopkins was from Calcott, and he was buried June the 29th. But the diary of William Thomas gives us a lot more information. It indicates where Calcott was located. We could come up with that information ourselves, but the rest of it is where it really starts to pay off. We get his age, the length of his illness before he died, and we get his occupation, understanding what his occupation was and where he worked gives us a lot of opportunity to look into occupational records and other materials that might tell us more about him. The real gold here is the fact that he only had a daughter alive at the time of his death, and that he was the older brother of Nicholas Hopkins and William Hopkins, both of those individuals living in different parishes than where he was. So this gives us a lot of information that the church records for the time period wouldn't, and indicating just again how much value we can get from some of these diaries and other types of contemporary accounts. This situation, we have an example from a parliamentary inquiry into children working in mines, and Margaret Hipps gives some detail about her working situation. And as we look at this illustration and hear her description, it's really tearjerker in my opinion. And she's not alone. But if you look at this, she would have to go down into the pit, load 200 to 300 pounds of coal into this slipe, and it gave them a lot of opportunity for employment, for making money, but what they had to do for this was just unimaginable to me. And she describes what it was like, the fact that this passageway that she had to crawl through, pulling 200 to 300 pounds of coal, was only as tall as a kitchen table. So if you think about the possibility of you pulling 200 to 300 pounds underneath your kitchen table, and the cart doesn't have wheels, and you have to do that for 200 to 400 yards. So the details we get, and the fact that the mechanism they used to hook onto the slipe or the cart that they were pulling actually caused damage to them or injured them. This is just full of examples from people in different parts of the UK, Scotland, England, Wales, and all parts of the country. So we get a lot of information. And again, this is close to census time period, so we can compare that information with other details that are available. Sometimes local histories done much earlier than what we normally get a hold of can be very helpful. In this case, we get the grandfather's name for Evan Evans, who was a policeman in the town of Neath in South Wales. And it also identifies where he was raised, the farm where he was raised, which gives us a lot of detail that we can use. And it's really critical for a situation when we're dealing with somebody like Evan Evans. When you're working with a common name ancestor, you really do need all the help you can get. And thankfully, the help's there if we look a little deeper than just the census and church records and vital records that we normally use. This particular story struck me because my niece was talking recently about the fact that she was knitting and selling items to help their family, and it made it so possible for them to go to a restaurant and have a dinner as a family, which they normally wouldn't be able to do. And this lady, J.H. from Flintshire in Wales, actually did laundry for other people. And because she did that, they were able to furnish their home a little bit better. The other thing that she gets into detail about was the situation with the pay. They didn't get paid on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly basis. There was no consistency on when they would get paid. They got paid when the mine owners or the quarry owners wanted or were willing to pay them. And so they had to go on credit, and most of the butchers wouldn't allow credit. So it limited what they could eat, although I'm sure their pay had a big effect on that also. But there's a lot of detail that we can get into about how they had to live because of the way that they were paid. And this is just one example that gives us some of that detail. Another source that comes from a series of newspaper articles done by the Morning Chronicle, which have been published now. They went through different parts of England and interviewed individuals, and this shows a series of back-to-back houses in Birmingham. Now, this picture dates from 1893. The newspaper account comes from 1849, so it would have been a little bit different, and this is probably a newer place. But if you think about what we're looking at and then read the account, the ladies were forced to use water pumps at either end of the court, and in the case, the account in the newspaper of the Morning Chronicle, one of those pumps didn't work, and there were 53 families, I think, that were dependent on that water pump for their water needs. But what was most interesting is that the water had a gas smell, and it was so bad that the ladies would use it to wash their floors and clean their house or their lodgings, and they were constantly stuck with that smell of gas on their hands and on their clothes. In fact, it was so bad that they had to buy canned water that was brought in from outside. And this really struck me because I just never would have thought that people back in the 1840s in England would be buying water. When I grew up, we just drank water from the tap, and so even today, buying and drinking bottled water is a little bit odd to me, but I'd never considered that our ancestors would have been doing something similar in the 1840s. But the newspaper accounts from the Morning Chronicle help illustrate how our ancestors lived, and in many cases were forced to live. One of the sources that I found is from the Women's Cooperative Guild, and this was from the early 1900s in England and Wales, and these many ladies sent in letters detailing their experiences with life, and most particularly with maternity and child rearing. And this lady, in her information, said that she was had a family, big family, and she they'd gotten into debt because of complications with childbirth and other health issues. And here she is, she's in her later years, she's got a big deficit, varicose veins, and the occasional loss of use of her hands. And that stems from a situation where she had a doctor that wasn't healthy when he was treating her, and she got sick because of him. So we can read about the details of our ancestors' lives or people like our ancestors, and then understand a little bit better the situations they were living in. Now, the syllabus or the handout for this class gives details about how you can find some of these types of sources. There are a couple of ways you can do that. And one way is that you can go to FamilySearch and go to the Search tab, and then go to the FamilySearch Wiki, the Research Wiki, where we have some pages set up to identify this type of source that I've been showing examples from. You can go to the search box on the FamilySearch Wiki page and use the country that you're looking to do research in and the terms social life and customs. When you do that search, you'll get a list of different sources that we've identified where you can get this kind of information or detail about the lives that people led. Sometimes very early. The earliest one that I'm aware of that is extremely useful is the History of Middle, and that was published about done about 1701. So there are sources that cover earlier time periods, and the resources for later time periods are really quite extensive. Source like the one that I've got highlighted in red here gives details about landed families, but it is a good resource for us to look at because so many of our families worked for these large landowners. And so we can help build context around the lives of our ancestors, even if it doesn't deal directly with them or the exact work that they did. The one here at the bottom, this example is interesting because there are 3,000 hours of audio recordings. Sometimes we're able to get oral history information that goes back into the early 1900s, and it can be extremely interesting to access that kind of information also. Now, as you look at the FamilySearch Wiki for items that might be already listed, you can try different countries. We've got several countries that have had this kind of work gathered. It's not a complete project yet. It's still in process. For Italy, I was interested in what might be available for the island of Sardinia, where I served while I was in the Air Force. And there are several things here for Italy, but nothing for Sardinia. So the next tool that I want to point you to is WorldCat. This is a catalog consortium, so to speak. It gives library catalog holdings for libraries all over the world. And one of the nice things it'll do is identify, if you put your zip code in or postcode, libraries near you that have a copy of the book that you found. So in this particular case, I found a book available on Sardinian costumes. And they have some really, really cool costumes from history that I saw while I was at different events in Sardinia. And this would be a really neat one to look at, especially if I had ancestors from this area. And so you can use the social life and customs topic to search WorldCat for your country or locality that you're interested in, and possibly find some additional sources that we've not been able to list in the Family History Library catalog yet. If you find something in your searches or know of sources that are not listed for the locality or the country under social life and customs, then you can use this link in the FamilySearch Wiki to submit wiki content, and you can let us know about information that you've found or have knowledge of that would be useful to add to this resource. And as this grows, people will be able to learn more and more about how their ancestors lived, the interactions they had, and in a few cases, they'll be able to find details about their own ancestor. And that makes it a whole lot more fun when you can put flesh on the bones of your family history, when you can discover the stories and the situations that they lived in. Then it makes family history much, much more enjoyable and rewarding. Thank you.